The sun was setting as an elderly man walked slowly toward a shiny car dealership. His clothes were simple, slightly worn, but clean. He had saved for years, dreaming of buying a reliable car to make his life easier. His old truck had finally given up, and he needed something new, or at least new to him. The moment he stepped inside, the bright lights and polished floors made him pause. Salespeople in crisp suits moved around, chatting with well-dressed customers. No one noticed him at first. Then, a young salesman glanced his way, smirked, and whispered something to his colleague. They both laughed. The elderly man approached the counter, his voice polite but quiet. "Excuse me, I'd like to see." The salesman cut him off with a wave. "Sorry, sir, our cars here are pretty expensive. Maybe check down the street?" His tone was dripping with fake sympathy. The old man's face fell, but he didn't argue. He just nodded and turned to leave. Behind him, he heard muffled laughter. His hands clenched slightly, but he kept walking. Outside, the cool evening air brushed against his face. He took a deep breath, looking back at the dealership one last time. A quiet determination settled in his eyes. The old man didn't go home right away. Instead, he sat on a bench across the street from the dealership, watching as customers came and went. Luxury cars gleamed under the showroom lights, and salesmen in sharp suits laughed with buyers who looked like they had money to spare. His fingers tapped lightly on his knee as he thought. He wasn't a rich man, but he wasn't poor either. He had worked hard his whole life, saved, invested wisely, and lived simply. But he never cared for fancy clothes or showing off. Maybe that was his mistake today. A small smile tugged at his lips as an idea formed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old flip phone. Scrolling through his contacts, he stopped at a number he hadn't called in years. After a brief conversation, he stood up, his steps lighter than before. He had a plan. The next morning, the dealership was busy as usual. The same young salesman from yesterday was leaning against a sports car, chatting with a colleague. "Remember that old guy from yesterday?" he said, chuckling. "Bet he went to some junkyard instead." Just then, the glass doors slid open. A hush fell over the showroom as all eyes turned toward the entrance. The elderly man walked in, but this time, he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a well-dressed businessman, his sharp suit and confident stride making it clear he was someone important. The salesman's smirk faded as he recognized the man, the owner of one of the biggest companies in town. The old man glanced around, his expression calm. Then, in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, he said, "I'd like to buy a car today. The best one you have." The salesman's face turned pale. The well-dressed businessman stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the showroom floor. The air in the dealership had gone still, even the other customers had stopped to watch. The young salesman swallowed hard, forcing a shaky smile. How can I help you gentlemen today?" His voice was nothing like the mocking tone he'd used the day before. The old man didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to the businessman beside him. "This is the place," he said simply. The businessman nodded, then looked at the salesman with icy calm. "You work on commission, don't you?" The salesman hesitated. "Why yes, sir." A slow smile spread across the businessman's face. "Good. Then today, you're going to earn nothing." Before the salesman could react, the businessman turned to the elderly man. "Uncle, pick whichever car you want. Money isn't an issue." "Uncle?" The word hit the showroom like a bomb. The salesman's mouth fell open. The other employees exchanged panicked glances. The old man walked past the stunned salesman without even looking at him. He stopped in front of the most expensive car in the dealership, a sleek, top-of-the-line luxury sedan. He ran a hand over the hood, then turned back to the businessman. "I'll take this one." Then, with a quiet but firm voice, he added, "But not from him." He pointed to another salesman, a younger guy who had been quietly organizing brochures in the corner yesterday, the only one who hadn't laughed. The businessman nodded. Smart choice. As the ignored salesman stood there, face burning with humiliation, the old man and his nephew walked toward the polite salesman, who was now about to make the biggest sale of his career. The polite salesman, a young man with nervous but kind eyes, straightened his tie as the old man and the businessman approached him. He had seen everything, the disrespect yesterday, the shock today. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the keys to the luxury sedan. This model has all the latest safety features, sir," he stammered, trying to stay professional despite his racing heart. "And the engine?" The businessman held up a hand, smiling. "No need for the pitch. We'll take it." The salesman blinked. "Just like that?" "Just like that," the old man said, his voice warm. "You treated me like a person yesterday. That's worth more than any discount." Meanwhile, the rude salesman had recovered enough to step forward, desperation in his voice. "Sir, I can offer you a better deal. Extended warranty, free maintenance." The businessman didn't even turn to look at him. "We're done here." The message was clear. As the paperwork was being finalized, the dealership manager rushed over, his face pale. He had just recognized the businessman, not just a local big shot, but the owner of several car dealerships across the state, including a rival chain. "Mr. Reynolds," the manager gasped, wiping sweat from his brow. "I had no idea you were coming. If there's been any misunderstanding." The businessman, Mr. Reynolds, finally turned, his expression unreadable. "No misunderstanding. Just a lesson." He glanced at his uncle, who was now sitting comfortably in the plush leather seat of his new car, looking happier than he had in years. Then Mr. Reynolds lowered his voice, speaking only to the manager. "You have an employee problem. Fix it. Or I'll buy this place and fix it for you." The manager's mouth went dry. He knew it wasn't a threat, it was a promise. The paperwork was signed in record time. As the old man settled into the driver's seat of his new car, he ran his hands over the smooth leather steering wheel. For the first time in years, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. He wasn't the type to gloat, but justice, even the quiet kind, felt good. Meanwhile, inside the dealership, chaos was unfolding. The manager pulled the rude salesman into his office, slamming the door hard enough to make the walls shake. "Do you have any idea what you've just cost us?" he hissed, face flushed with anger. That wasn't just some random customer, that was the Mr. Reynolds. The salesman's bravado had completely evaporated. "I didn't know." "You didn't bother to find out," the manager snapped. "You took one look at a man and decided he wasn't worth your time. Well, guess what? He just decided you aren't worth ours." He tossed a folded envelope across the desk. "Clean out your desk." Outside, the old man started the engine, the purr of the powerful motor making him chuckle. His nephew leaned in through the open window. "All good?" The old man nodded. "Better than good." He paused, then added, "But I hope that young man, the polite one, ends up all right." Mr. Reynolds smiled. "Oh, he will. In fact." He pulled out his phone and sent a quick text. Inside, the kind salesman was still processing his massive commission when his own phone buzzed. The message made his eyes widen. "Meet me tomorrow at 9 a.m. Reynolds Auto Group. Ask for me personally. J. Reynolds." His hands shook as he stared at the screen. This wasn't just a lucky sale anymore, this was his entire life, about to change. The next morning, the polite salesman arrived at the Reynolds Auto Group headquarters 15 minutes early. His shoes were polished, his only good suit pressed, and his stomach twisted with nerves. The building was all glass and steel, sleek, modern, intimidating. The receptionist smiled the second he gave his name. "Oh. Mr. Reynolds is expecting you. Go right up, elevator to the top floor." When the elevator doors opened, Mr. Reynolds himself was waiting. No fancy office, no assistants, just him, leaning against the wall with 2 steaming cups of coffee. He handed one over. "Black, right? You seemed like a black coffee guy." The salesman blinked. How did you? I pay attention." Mr. Reynolds took a sip. Unlike some people. He led the way to a conference room with a stunning city view. "Here's the deal. My uncle liked you. And in this business, instincts like that? Priceless." He slid a folder across the table. "I'm opening a new dealership. I want you to run it." The salesman's coffee almost slipped from his fingers. "And me? But I've only been selling cars for 2 years. And in 2 years, you've never once judged a customer by their clothes." Mr. Reynolds' smile faded slightly. "That's rarer than you think." Meanwhile, the old man was driving his new car through the countryside, the sunroof open, wind ruffling his thin hair. He hadn't felt this light in decades. His phone buzzed, his nephew. He put it on speaker. "All right, Uncle, the kid's hired. Happy now?" The old man chuckled. "You didn't do it just for me." A pause. Then a laugh. "No. I did it for me too. Good people make good business." He hesitated. "Speaking of, you sure you don't want a driver? Or at least a newer house? That old place." "I like my house," the old man said firmly. "And I love driving this car." A mischievous glint came into his eye. "Maybe I'll visit that dealership again next week. See how their attitudes are these days." Mr. Reynolds groaned. "Please don't start a war." But they both knew, he already had. The fired salesman sat in his cramped apartment, staring at his emptied bank account on his laptop screen. Rent was due in 3 days. His ego had taken the first hit, now reality was crashing down. He cracked his knuckles, a bitter thought taking root, that old man ruined me. And he's probably laughing about it. He scrolled through his phone, stopping at a photo from last year's dealership holiday party, him standing beside the manager, grinning with a champagne glass. His thumb hovered over the delete button. Instead, he zoomed in on the background. There, barely visible, was the polite salesman handing a coat to some elderly couple. Always the nice guy. His jaw tightened. An idea formed. The old man was at a gas station, humming as he filled his new car. A shadow fell across the pump. "Well, well. Fancy ride for a nobody," a familiar voice sneered. The old man turned slowly. The fired salesman leaned against the next pump, sunglasses hiding his eyes. His smile was all teeth. "Funny how life works, huh? You flash some cash, suddenly you're a big shot." The old man screwed the gas cap back on. "You here to apologize?" The laugh that followed was sharp as broken glass. "Apologize? I'm here to warn you." He stepped closer, voice dropping. "That nephew of yours? He's got enemies. Powerful ones. And they'd pay good money to know his weak spot." He flicked the car's hood. "You." For the first time, the old man's calm wavered. His hands curled into fists at his sides, not in anger, but in something deeper. Fear. Not for himself. The salesman saw it. His grin widened. "Yeah. Thought that'd get your attention." He pulled out a burner phone, tossed it into the old man's chest. "Next time he texts you, tell him to back off. Or else." Tires screeched as a black SUV peeled into the station. The salesman bolted, but not before the old man caught a glimpse of the driver. The dealership manager. The old man stood frozen in the gas station parking lot, the burner phone gripped tight in his hand. His heart pounded, not from fear for himself, but for his nephew. He'd never been a man of violence or schemes, but right now, he had to act. He reached for his own phone, then stopped. What if they're watching? Instead, he got in his car and drove, not home, not to his nephew's office, but to the one place no one would expect. The Reynolds family farm, 45 minutes later. The old barn smelled of hay and motor oil. The old man pulled a tarp off a dusty workbench, revealing an ancient rotary phone, the kind that couldn't be traced. He dialed a number he knew by heart. His nephew answered on the first ring. "Uncle? You okay?" Your text sounded. "Listen close," the old man interrupted, voice steady. "That fired kid's got the manager wrapped up in something. They threatened you. Through me." A long silence. Then, cold steel crept into his nephew's voice. "Where are you?" "Safe. But we need to end this. Your way." Dealership that night, 11:47 p.m. Security cameras glitched for exactly 37 seconds, just long enough for two figures to slip inside. The fired salesman and the manager stood in the dark showroom, flashlights scanning the luxury cars. "You sure the safe's in the back?" the salesman whispered. "Just shut up and..." The lights blazed on. Mr. Reynolds stepped out from behind a SUV, arms crossed. Behind him, police radios crackled. But it was the old man who spoke first, holding up the burner phone. "You should have picked a better password than your birthday." He tapped the screen, a recorded confession played aloud. The manager lunged, straight into an officer's grip. Epilogue, 1 week later. The kind salesman, now a dealership GM, served coffee in his new office. The old man sipped his, eyeing the newspaper headline, "Auto execs arrested in blackmail scheme." His nephew smirked. "Told you I'd handle it." The old man huffed. "We handled it." He tossed keys on the desk, the fired salesman's repoed sports car. "For your lot. Sell it to some college kid." As laughter filled the room, the old man smiled. Justice tasted better than revenge.